going to show how to make this plaid pattern using Affinity Photo's procedural texture filter. This is based on the plaid pattern that I did earlier, but I modified it a little bit, simplified it in some ways, made it more complicated in others. Instead of building the colors directly into the pattern, I'm now just creating a grayscale pattern and then applying a gradient map. That way I can make several copies of the procedural textures and add them together until I get the final overall effect. To get started, I'll start with a new blank document. I'm going to make it 1024 by 1024. Pixels, make sure its color is set to RGB, create that, and fill it with black. I'm going to add a live procedural texture. I'm going to add a single equation, and I'm going to add a single real number custom input. I'm going to set that up to 6. For this one, I'm going to assign it to all 3 channels, and I'm going to start with a coordinate vector, var, v equals vec2 of x comma y. For this one, I'm using xy rather than relative xy because I don't want the different layers to be out of sync with each other. If I happen to drag one a little bit, it'll throw everything off. Times a divided by w. Now I'm going to create a oscillator. I'm going to use a single oscillator, OSC, of v.x. So this will take the x component of the vector and apply this oscillator function to it. The oscillator goes in a linear fashion from 0 to 1, back down to 0, back up to 1, back and forth like that. So the regular OSC oscillator just behaves sort of like a triangle waveform, going from bright to dark, and repeating. Now, to do this, I want to have a series of white and black stripes. So to get that, I'm going to use the step function, and I'm going to set an edge on here. Anything that's below the value of that edge value will be black. Anything above that will be white. So I'll add another custom input labeled E, and there is my edge. I'm going to label this one scale and this one line width. Now I want to create a pattern of squares, and so I'm going to create another copy of this. I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to add it to this one like that, and I'm going to change this one to v.y. Now when I move my slider, I can control the line width of these. So I can have either little squares or big squares, or if I look at the lines, I can have thin lines or fat lines, depending on how I move this. Now where it starts to get interesting is if I multiply this by a fader value I, and assign that to a slider here, and I'll just call that the fader. Now as I bring this down, you can see it goes from being a purely black and white image to now a grayscale image, where I have these different levels of intensity. Now for this one, the next thing I wanted to do was to be able to black out certain areas. I'm going to make another copy of this and multiply this by a copy of it, like that. And on this one, I'm going to have a second edge. So since I have 2 different edges, I'm going to call this one edge 2, and I'm going to change the name of this one to edge 1. This is going to be edge 1. This one will be edge 2, and that will be, I'm going to call this gap thickness. I'm going to call this one line thickness. So that's a gap. So now I can create another sort of overlying pattern of a gap on this one. Now I want to make it so that I can adjust this first oscillator function sort of independently of the second one. So to do that, I'm going to multiply the v.x times b. And I'm going to add another custom input. I'm just going to call this one lines, and this will be the number of lines that I have. So as I bring this up, I'll get more lines. But it's going to interact with this gap function here. And so those two will sort of interact with each other to create a bit more complex pattern. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to be able to rotate this. To rotate it, I'm going to change my basic XY coordinates to my rotatable coordinate system. I'll add an angle input theta, or TH. I'll call that angle. And I'm going to replace this plane XY with x times cosine of theta minus y times sine of theta, and x times sine of theta plus y times cosine of theta. And now I should be able to rotate this, so now I can get any type of angle from this pattern. The other thing I want to do is I want to be able to shift it. So right now it's fine, but as I add more layers over here, I want to be able to shift them relative to each other. So I'm going to add another variable. I'm going to make it a -1 to 1 range input. I'm going to call that OF for offset, and this will be, I'll just label it shift. And I have to add that in anywhere I have a coordinate. So I'm going to do that just plus OF here, and here, and here, and here. So now that allows me to shift these over like that. Now it turns out after I was working with this a while, I found out that I sort of was working with the fader all the way down here on this end as I added these together. And it turns out it works a little better if I actually raise this to a power. I'm just going to put this in parentheses and have it I to the second power. So I have I squared there. And now I'm going to go and add an adjustment layer. All right, I'm going to choose this one. This is a 5-color palette, so I'm just going to use that. And I just got this, found this on the internet. Now I'm going to select this, right click, and hit duplicate. I have another copy of this. I'm going to change the mode of this to add. So I'm adding the two layers together. I'm going to go to this one. I think I'm going to simplify this a little bit down to 1. And I'm going to bring this fader down just a little bit. And then over on this one, I'm going to bring the fader down a little. And I can see when it's starting to come in with the colors. Let's leave that at 3. And I could also shift these over either here or here. I'll just leave it in the middle for now. Then I can adjust the gap if I want a smaller gap or a bigger gap on these. And then I could also change the angle. So right now I have it set to 45. Now when I change the angle to 45, suddenly it looks sort of off. It isn't aligned properly. And the reason is across the diagonal, it's related by it's the square root of 2 compared to 1. So 1 unit on here is square root of 2 across the diagonal. So if I do, I'm going to multiply this by 0.707, which is equal to the square root of 2 over 2, approximately. And now it's nice and aligned. I've got my pattern aligned, and I can go like that. I can shift this over if I wanted to just offset it a little bit or leave it centered or bring it all the way over so it's still basically aligned. Then I can change the this fader. It'll give me different color options for depending on my gradient map. Here's the final formula. I've got my variable v with the rotatable coordinates, which is vec2 x times cosine of theta minus y times the sine of theta, comma, x times sine of theta plus y times cosine of theta times a over w. Then I've got my fader factor, I squared, and that's multiplied by this whole thing in parentheses. First, I have 2 step functions added together, and then they're multiplied by the second 2 step functions. So these are my original striped pattern, and then this is the sort of the gap pattern is what I was thinking of. For this one, I have step E1, comma, oscillator OSC v.x times b plus OF for the offset, and then plus step E1 OSC v.y times b plus OF for the offset. So I have this b factor, the number of lines in both the .x and the .y oscillators. Over here, it's basically the same thing, but I don't have the b factor multiplied times the coordinates. So it's step E2, comma, OSC of v.x plus OF, plus step of E2, OSC of v.y plus OF. Now you could play around with this a little bit more. You could change this instead of having both x and the y times b, you could just have one of them times b, and it'll create a different effect with that. Another thing you could do, instead of a regular step, you could use a smooth step for these. So if I change that to smooth step, I need to put in an additional parameter. I already used E1 and E2, so I'll just call it E3. Now this will work best if I have it E1 plus E3, and if I make this one E1 plus E3, and so the E3 and the E4 values are just taking these and sort of rounding them off. E2 plus E4. So this controls my original line thickness. Let's see if I turn the gap. I'm going to turn the gap all the way off, and I'm going to turn this all the way off and this all the way off. So here's my original lines, and then I can add the smoothness factor to them like that. I bring this down a little bit here, add my gap thickness, but then I can smooth that out as well, and so I can create patterns like that. So in this case, I've created a smooth step function, and then I added an extra parameter here, and I have E1 comma E1 plus E3, and also for this one. And then over here, I have smooth step. I've changed this to E2 plus E4, and the same thing over here for this function, for the y value. So overall, you can create quite a wide variety of different effects with this, starting out with this sort of simple basic pattern. So it no longer really looks like plaid anymore, and I guess I'm not really sure what to call that. It's sort of a fun little pattern. Let me know if you have any comments or questions, and thanks for watching.